All right, guys, this is your lesson on Earth's layers. So we've got a list over here on the left that tells us what we're going to be talking about, and then on the right you can see a diagram of the Earth. Now, this diagram is what it might look like if we sliced the Earth in half. So it looks kind of like somebody took a gobstopper and broke it straight down the middle, okay? So we can see all of Earth's layers this way, and if we look at the list over here, I've kind of color-coded it so it'll be a little bit easier when you go back to look at it to study, okay? So the first thing we are going to work from the outside in. So the first layer we're going to talk about is the crust. So if you see this green and blue layer around the very outside of Earth, that is Earth's crust. Now, I've color coded it to kind of help us remember where stuff goes and why it's in those places. So the first kind of crust we're going to talk about is the oceanic crust. That is the crust that is underneath the ocean. Okay, so that bit of crust is a little bit more dense than the rest of the crust. So next we have the continental crust. So if you look over here on the diagram, that's those pieces where it would be green, where there would be dry land. So if you're on dry land, you're under what we would consider continental crust, and the oceanic crust is beneath the oceans. So when I'm saying underwater, I don't mean like a lake or a pond or a little river. I'm talking about the ocean. So the oceanic crusts are under the ocean, and the continental crust is where we are on dry land. All right. The next layer down is still kind of considered part of the crust, is the asthenosphere. And I know that's a big word. I'll say it a little bit slower. It is said exactly like it's spelled. All right, asthenosphere. Okay, so that is represented by that purple line on Earth's diagram over here on the right hand side. Okay, now it's not as thick as the crust, it's just a little bit of stuff stuck to the underside of the crust. Okay, so it's where it starts to get kind of gooey and melty in Earth's interior. Okay, so I made it a little bit thicker so it'll be a little bit easier for us to see and to talk about. So the asthenosphere is a little bit of that gooey stuff from underneath the Earth, what we would call magma, that sticks to the plates. So it's going to stay with Earth's crust. It's going to move with Earth's crust, so it's considered part of the crust. Now, if we're talking about the crust and the asthenosphere together, when we're talking about Earth's plates, which is what we're going to talk about next, we're talking about the lithosphere. So Earth's lithosphere is the crust and that little asthenosphere that's stuck to it. So when we talk about lithospheric plates, we're talking about the dry land, the ocean, and that little bit of that molten, gooey stuff on the inside of Earth, the magma that's stuck to that crust, okay? Our next layer down in yellow, I've color coded it with the list, in yellow, that is our upper mantle. And we have the lower mantle as well. So we're going to talk about these two layers together. So the reason we divided into an upper mantle and a lower mantle is because something interesting happens in Earth's mantle. Okay, so I'm going to draw on the diagram a little bit while I'm talking about it. We talked about this when we talked about the sun. We talked about convection and how that moved through the sun. And the same thing happens on the inside of Earth. So when we talk about the upper mantle and the lower mantle, we're talking about them as zones of that same layer. Okay, so when we talked about convection, we talked about how it was that circular motion. Things would heat up at the bottom and heat rises, so it go up to the top. And when it cooled down, it would sink back down into the sun. So it does the same thing here, just like a pot of boiling water. We start near the middle, it gets hot, so it's going to rise up to the top, just like heat makes everything rise. And once it gets up to the top, it's going to cool down a little bit, and then it'll come back down into Earth. Okay, so that is mantle convection. So it's that circular motion that's happening because it's getting hot. So things get really hot here in the center of Earth, heat rises, so it comes up to the surface. When it gets near the surface, it cools down, and because it's cool, it starts to sink back down into Earth. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that mantle convection. I'm talking about the movement within those areas of the mantle. So that's the upper mantle in yellow and the lower mantle in orange as we get closer to the middle of Earth. Okay? Now, the next layer we're going to talk about is that red layer right here, almost in the very center. That is the outer core. And the outer core is really, really super hot, and it's not as liquid as the mantle, but it's still liquid. Okay? So we start out with the crust on the outside, that's solid. We come to the mantle where it's all gooey. We get to the outer core. It's still gooey, but it's not as gooey as the mantle. It's a little bit more solid. Okay? And then the very inner core, represented by that little black dot right there, is the inner core. Okay? And the inner core is actually solid. Even though it's super, super hot, it is solid. Okay? And that's because all the pressure of all the other layers that are pushing down on it, all that gravity is pulling into the middle, and it makes the inner core solid. Okay? Now, since the inner core is solid and the outer core is not, it's still moving, it's creating Earth's magnetic field. So the inner core and outer core are mostly made out of metal. Okay? And I'm going to write this over here on the list. I forgot to add that in before I started, but I'm going to put it in there for you. Okay? They're mostly made out of metal. All right? So when those metals are moving around each other, it creates an electromagnet. So we have our magnetic field. Earth's magnetic field exists because of the motion of the inner core and the outer core. Okay? So just to refresh our brains, we are talking about the crust on the very outside, and then that purple layer just underneath the crust is the asthenosphere. But talking about the crust and the asthenosphere together, we call that the lithosphere, and we'll talk about that in our next lesson because we're going to talk about Earth's plates. And we're going to talk about why those plates move, which brings us to the next layer, the mantle convection. Mantle convection is that motion inside of Earth's mantle, which is what makes our plates move, which will be part of our next lesson. Okay? And that mantle convection is represented by those red arrows on our diagram. And then the next layer down is the outer core. The outer core is still liquid, but it's not as liquid as the mantle. And then we get to the inner core, that is a solid layer. Okay? And the movement of the outer core and the inner core, since they're mostly made out of metal, is what causes Earth's magnetic field. And that's it.